How's everybody feeling? Good. Right. Really good. Yeah. So welcome. Big thanks to Greenway Court Theatre for having us out. Muhammad, Whitney, Pearson, Jasmine, the whole crew, we appreciate this opportunity, and we're very excited for our first live podcast. And thanks to all of you for coming out. Yeah. Thanks to you that are here with us this evening, and to folks that are out there in the live stream world. We appreciate you beaming on in. I'm Tony Tolbert. This is my man, Adam Radinsky. We met about 40 years ago in our first year of law school, and we've been tight ever since. I could tell you some stories, but I won't. We launched Pay the Tab Reparations Now in May. This is our 8th episode, and we're two lawyers doing what we can to make the case for reparations, doing our part to spark conversation, thought, and action around the call for reparations now. So we're thrilled to have all of you with us for today's conversation.
Yeah, we're super excited to be here for our first live episode, and we have an amazing guest with us tonight, Professor Robin D.G. Kelley, a preeminent American writer, thinker, and activist. He's distinguished professor and endowed chair in American history at UCLA. Robin is a leading truth teller of our time. His research goes deep into all kinds of topics, from the history of social movements in the US, the struggles of working people for a better life, music, culture, and many others. Just last week, Robin was interviewed in The New Yorker about the latest political, cynical witch hunts going on, of which he is one of the prime targets. Professor Kelley's books are rich and they are numerous. Just a couple of examples: Race Rebels, Culture, Politics, and the Black Working Class, and Thelonious Monk, The Life and Times of an American Original, which is an amazing book. If you happen to be a jazz fan, it is a long and deep, delicious feast of a book.
Yeah, so today's conversation is about Robin's groundbreaking book, Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination. It was first published in 2002, and Freedom Dreams is regarded as one of the essential works on the struggle for Black liberation and the liberation of all people. Last year, he released an updated 20th anniversary version with new insights and observations gleaned from the past 2 decades. And it's really the perfect book, and he's the perfect guest for tonight's event, to dive into what a reimagined Black future can look like and how we get there. So we're in for a special treat, folks. Let's give it up for Robin D.G. Kelley.
Okay, see, if this were really like a podcast, not live, you could edit all that stuff out. You know, and clearly the podcast, is this where the revolution takes place? The podcast? If not televised, but the podcast, right?
That's right. Well, Robin Kelley, we want to welcome you to Pay the Tab, and Tony and I are truly over the moon to have you here for conversation. So we want to dig into this book with you right away, and maybe as good a place as any to start out is, tell the folks, what do you mean by freedom dreams, and why are they important to people who are working for change?
Sure. I wrote the book at a particular moment in history when it was the turn of the 21st century, and Amadou Diallo had been killed and his killers had been exonerated. We were protesting around that. This was on the eve of 9/11, so a lot was going on. In terms of what the book tried to do was, I was dealing with students, very much like students today. There was a kind of cynicism, despite all the struggles that emerged in the 1990s, the cynicism kind of took the form of, where are the movements today? What do they look like? And they wanted to reach back to the 1960s to discover models. And, I would make them do these projects where they would create websites for existing social movements, whether it's Harlem Tenants League or whatever it was happening, critical resistance, and they got a sense of what was happening. So I wrote this book really for the students to try to get past this idea that you could find the successful movements by the ones that win their demands. when in fact, sometimes the demands not only shift, but what we find when we look at movements that may not win their demands, that those demands actually are not only meaningful, but they envision a different future. And so in terms of this particular theme, I have a chapter on reparations, which I'd been working on in the late 1990s, and the idea behind it in the theme of Freedom Dreams to talk not about like how much, like the calculus of what people should get paid, but specifically what does the idea of reparations mean for trying to remake the world? In other words, is it just a matter of transferring wealth, or is it a matter of actually changing our social arrangements? And you cannot, in fact, the sister who talked about in the poem, who talked about inhumane society. You can't have reparations in an inhumane society. In other words, you can't have reparations under capitalism. I mean, true reparations, and maintain capitalism, okay? Some people want to fight me. I don't care. You'll fight. But what does it mean when you then take your money and invest in inhumane practices, in inhumane systems? So part of this chapter was to show that most Black radical movements for reparations actually weren't trying to get money in individual coffers, but trying to invest in social movements that could change the nation and the planet.
So Robin, in the 20 years since Freedom Dreams was first published, you know, a lot of folks have described it as somewhat of a guide or a manifesto, right, for a new generation of activists and organizers. But you frame it more in terms of an invitation.
Right.
So can you break down the distinction and what does that invitation entail?
Right. Well, the most important thing is that it's not a blueprint and not a guide, and people see it that way. There's no possible way that anyone could write a blueprint or a guide in real time, because one of the main arguments of the book is that, you know, when I talk about Freedom Dreams is not like individuals, you know, going to sleep and waking up with these ideas, and they write their utopian ideas on Post-it notes. It's about engaging in collective struggle, in political struggle. And in being involved in movements means that you're part of a collective that makes mistakes, that debates what is it you really want, and that in the process of struggling, those ideas change. Sometimes they're consolidated, sometimes they fall apart, but that process, the invitation really is the invitation to basically be active, to be in struggle in movements that actually are trying to do more than solve immediate problems, although that's part of what you're doing as well. So for me, I'm hoping that students, readers, activists, organizers can take the ideas or the lessons from movements for land, for reparations, for socialism, Black feminism, and draw from those lessons ways to build movements for today. And those lessons are always about understanding time, place, conditions, understanding not just what's possible, but what is in front of you that keeps you from seeing what's possible, you know? And that's sort of the invitation.
You talk about Dr. King's last Sunday sermon before he was assassinated in the book, and how that holds a powerful place for you. And I think that leads into some of the visions for what the future can look like and what people are doing in some places right now. Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, I guess so.
Only if you want.
Well, you know,
talking about.
Yeah, I'm also trying to connect everything to reparations, because
and you don't have to.
Yeah, but you know, we got to pay the tab.
Well, we will. We'll get there.
We'll get there. We're getting there.
We'll definitely get to the tab.
Got to figure that.
But we want you to stretch out, and
Yeah.
you know, these are some things that we would love to hear about.
Yeah. Well, you know, part of that last sermon, which actually is reflective of a lot of things that Dr. King was saying between 1967 and 68 when he died. And it was a critique, again, to go back, it was a critique of an inhumane society, a society built on, of course, as we know, the triplets although it's more than triplets, it's quadruplets. You could talk about militarism, materialism, and racism, and patriarchy, and homophobia and transphobia, and and the war on the planet, which of course is tied to militarism, racism, patriarchy, and materialism. So, in a sense, we're surrounded by movements always that I think are building on this idea, and when I think about these movements, I don't want to just limit us to the United States. Because, of course, any discussion of reparations has to recognize that liberation and oppression are no respecter of nations. The national boundaries are themselves arbitrary, and they do more to exclude than include. And so we have to basically see King's dream or King's critique within a global framework. And when we talk about something like reparations, it's really, I think, limiting when we think only about, say, Black people of US descent and how to solve that problem. Or Black people just in the global North, as if the impact of colonialism, post-colonial order, and slavery hasn't devastated the continent of Africa, And we have to pay attention to that as well. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's what I'm thinking about.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely.
So shifting gears a little bit, so we're here at Greenway Court Theatre, which is home to the Poetry Lounge, which for some of you may know, that's the longest running weekly spoken word event in the country. And it served as one of the inspirations for Deaf Poetry Jam. So, Robin, in the book, you quote disability justice scholar Claudia Pena on the role of poets and artists, right? And I'll read something that you wrote. Artists are truth tellers and storytellers, and that's what we need to give us hope to prevail through these difficult times. They also offer an imagination beyond what people can see right now, thus opening a portal to new tomorrows. So if you wouldn't mind elaborating on the connection between art and truth-telling, art and liberation.
Right. Well, it's not an accident that, jail cells around the world are full of poets, and playwrights. And I'm not suggesting that all things that pass as art are necessarily like questioning or challenging the status quo, but oftentimes artists, that's a responsibility to tell the truth, even difficult truth. And so, I was so appreciated hearing, the great Gil Scott-Heron's daughter both, revise The Revolution Won't Be Televised, as well as her own amazing poem. And I'm always reminded that, Gil Scott-Heron, one of his early pieces was Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul? And what was amazing about that was its truth-telling. It's truth-telling that goes way beyond the question of calculus, but also way beyond the question of slavery and descendants of enslavement, because he talks about indigenous peoples, and a lot of people weren't doing that. He was connecting the question of decolonization and reparations in a way that was a signal to all of us. And for a lot of people, that particular poem, didn't satisfy what people wanted from him. But do you think he cared? When he talks about, he's one of the few people to critique the no-knock laws, which was not just in New York, but of course you're talking to lawyers, so you know all about that, where, where cops could go in to a home, with a warrant, but they don't have to knock. What is no knock if not one of the justifications for the killing of Breonna Taylor, right? And we know that. And Gil Scott-Heron could have done something different. He could have made, poetry about being a billionaire. I wonder who does that. Let's see, who does that? Oh, I know. Jay-Z, Beyonce, Rihanna. I know you love these people, but I'm like, they're making choices about what their music's about. It's about money. We're in a world right now where so many people who are the artists of the day are obsessed with making money, with wealth accumulation. And we could talk about that later, but when you are a struggling artist and you make choices to critique the system and you pay the price, that's what it means to be a truth teller. Now, let me just say one last thing about that. I mean, I mentioned a lot of young artists and current artists, like Aja Monet, for example, who wrote the foreword to the new edition, who's an amazing poet, has a new album that just dropped. And she's one of many, many people. One of my inspirations was Sekou Sundiata, who passed away too early, and my daughter's named after him. But Sekou was another one who made certain choices to create art for the sake of advancing an idea of creating new collectives of people, right? But in the end, and this is a challenge to all of us, we have to think about what it means when we spend huge amounts of money to support artists who are already billionaires to basically make music about billionaires versus artists who are struggling and, sometimes on the street and we pass them by. How do we build collective support so that those artists who really are telling the truth, who have risked their lives and their futures to do the work that they're doing, we need to figure out a way to support them and figure out a way to withdraw money from the people who already have a lot of it, And that's part of the story of reparations, because some people have to pay the tab.
Yeah. Well, we definitely want to talk to you more about reparations, Robin, and you make a real deep point about how we have to change the structure of our society first and foremost, right? And I think your voice is always on our shoulders whenever we talk about reparations and different approaches, because you're kind of like the voice of the Godfather, right? Like, yeah, guys, but you got to keep this in mind. And so one thing that some people might say when we're talking about reparations now, like what are the current conversations about it? And as you point out in the book, most of those conversations are well within our system, right? And about money and qualification and so forth. But some people might say, maybe we can't get rid of capitalism just yet.
Right.
Maybe we can't get rid of racism right now, but some cash could help, right? I can't pay my bills, and some form of reparations could be very, very helpful in the form of cash.
Right.
Not as the only thing, but as perhaps a start or at least a conversation. So how do you respond?
Right.
I mean, I'm sure you've heard some of those words.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. And by the way, just before I answer the question, just keep in mind that reparations are being paid all the time, just so you know that. When we think about big pharma and the damage that these corporations did to people in terms of opioid addiction, when they're making payouts, it's a form of reparations. You think about the Chicago Police Department, just one of many, that is basically the largest gang in Chicago, organized gang. And I say that not even being tongue-in-cheek. It's the largest organized gang in that city. And how many billions of dollars, really, over the last 20 years, they've paid out in wrongful death cases, in police brutality, misconduct. I mean, we're talking about billions of dollars, which, by the way, the city has to borrow money to pay that, because cops don't have to pay it themselves because of liability. So you have that. So we see reparations all the time, and yet we're not supposed to talk about them, according to my friend Ron DeSantis, because it is a violation, right? It makes people uncomfortable. So to go back to this question of what does it mean to put cash in people's pockets? I think that it goes both ways. What does it mean to take cash from those who basically are doing damage to us, you know? So to literally transfer, and that's what the idea of defund means. To defund one segment of society that's killing us and take the funds to invest, divest from one, invest in another. So even though this may not look like reparations, to basically reduce our military budget, which keeps going higher and higher and higher for no reason, and move that money into actually improving cities and providing funds for schools, mental health, restoring public hospitals, all these kinds of things. This is a form of repair, of reparations. In terms of the historical reparations that we're more familiar with, that is reparations for Jim Crow, for slavery, I do think, I do always come back to the model of the Black Manifesto, which was drafted in 1969, which is so different from the way we think of reparations as a calculus. Because what they were asking for wasn't even that much money, $500 million, but the money would be distributed to specific kinds of causes and movements. So they're like, we want $10 million to go to the National Welfare Rights Organization so they could fight their fight. We want $20 million for land trust. We want like $10 or $20 million for a national black strike fund so that unions would be strengthened. See, we don't think about that. We think about, well, so can I get a Tesla or a Lexus with my money? And so this way of sort of getting cash into people's hands to buy homes. Let's talk about Evanston, where the idea was in Evanston, Illinois, to tax cannabis sales, right, and take that money and make it available as reparations to families who actually have roots in Evanston to buy homes. Well, it sounds like a good idea. $50,000 for down payment, $100,000, whatever. But what does it mean to get money to buy a home in a community where there's kind of predatory lending going on anyway? But with that community, the value of your home doesn't appreciate because you're surrounded by black people, right? Or where the value of your home, it is not enough to be able to sort of take a second loan, right? These kinds of things. In other words, racism still exists, and it ends up absorbing whatever cash you might get because you end up putting the money back into a system that still is differential, that still treats people unequal. So unless you solve one problem, then I'm not saying don't get the cash, but you got to think about, like, what do you do with that money? What do you do with those resources? What if reparations was about massive investments in communities? Massive investments. I don't mean small investments. What if the reparations was about eliminating police as we know it and replacing with public safety that actually works? What if reparations was about, providing social housing, and that the people who benefit from them, they may all be black, but they may not? Do we get mad about that? I mean, if you live in low-income communities and you have a massive infusion of capital in those, do you have to parse out who really is a descendant of slaves and who is not? It makes no sense, because it's too much work. It's one of the reasons why the National Welfare Rights Organization wanted to get rid of welfare and have basic income, because you got to pay all these social workers to do policing work. So you're doing the same thing. You're policing who deserves and who doesn't, who's a descendant of a slave and who's not. So to me, all that stuff is really problematic, but we have to get to the point of figuring out where the money's going to come from, how do you divest and reinvest, and how do you move funds and resources and infrastructure toward people who actually are descendants of not just slavery, but all forms of oppression going back. Because we know that the source of wealth in any country is labor, and that's just the beginning, because we haven't talked about decolonization, which is another issue.
Yeah, so there was a line in your book that really stood out to me. It says, money and resources are always important, but a new vision and new values cannot be bought, right? And you also explained that reparations, in terms of historical, early reparations movements, and now it isn't the end goal in and of itself, right? Can you, elaborate on that?
Yeah, and that goes again to the Black Manifesto and others, where, Black Manifesto and COBRA, the Provisional Government for the Republic of New Africa, I mean, these are all movements that, had these fairly elaborate but very specific plans for reparations. You can also talk about Queen Mother Moore and her efforts. And Queen Mother Moore is very interesting because she always said, we don't need a poverty program. That reparations is not supposed to be a poverty program. Reparations, in many ways, because she's talking about $500 trillion, should be transformative. And so, if that's the case in all circumstances, then the intention behind reparations is not just repair, but transformation. How do you provide resources to rebuild civil society among people whose lives have been destroyed by the elimination of the basic things that civil society requires? If your life has been destroyed by the lack of medical care, if your life has been destroyed by ongoing police violence, if your life has been destroyed by dilapidated housing, it's not enough to just fix the housing and put a hospital. How do you actually rebuild social relationships so that people could actually not only thrive but govern themselves? Education's important, but what good is free tuition if people don't even have the basic skills to be able to get and succeed at a university? How do you do that? And finally, what does it mean to just provide people with cash and in a food desert, or in circumstances where land is nothing but property, as opposed to a place that we're supposed to steward? And this, again, brings us back to the thing that's been haunting me, because one of my failures, I think, in Freedom Dreams in the first edition was my inability to see the relationship between decolonization, indigenous land-back movements, and reparations for Black people. Because so much of the reparations story that we know we've inherited is based on what? 40 acres and a mule, right? So this idea that, at the end of the period of enslavement, the Mafa, the catastrophe, that somehow if Black people had only gotten their land and resources, they'd have a kind of basis to develop economically and politically. And that's not untrue. But this is also a period during the Civil War and after of the Homestead Acts. And the Homestead Acts, were attempts by the federal government, not attempts, but the federal government basically took stolen land, it's all stolen land from indigenous people, but took land that was treaty land and just distributed it. Some Black people got some of the land, not much, very few, and some of the Black towns were built on homestead land. But what does it mean to dispossess people of land, to not actually abide by treaties, and not to recognize the true stewards of the land, and build reparations based on the idea of land as property? So we really are serious about reparations. We've got to follow first the question of decolonization and land back. And that has to be first. I mean, I know that sounds harsh, but it has to be first because we can't simply reduce it to redistributing land without actually resolving that issue. So imagine a reparations project that considers that in addition to the dismantling of a system that hoards wealth. In the short term, there's some things we could do. We could change tax codes. We could, invest in education, all that stuff. But to me, if I really believe in what I write, we can't stop there. You know, it has to be just the beginning.
Fantastic, thank you so much. By the way, quick announcement for you guys here in the live theater audience that you will have an opportunity to participate in this podcast in a moment. We're going to have a brief question and answer session, so get your light bulbs going. We have time for at least a few questions, but I want to take note of a reparations dignitary who is among us tonight. She is the chair of the Revolutionary California Reparations Task Force. She's a friend of the pod, and she is the guest on our most downloaded episode. Please say hello to Camila Moore.
Thanks, Camila. Camila, you remember me from coming to my office in those days? I have to say, you got to understand how amazing Camila is. Not only brilliant and courageous, but when she was a student at UCLA, she was taking stands on things that nobody was willing to take a stand on, especially Palestine, and was bold and amazing and one of my heroes. So thank you.
You know, in the book, Freedom Dreams, which you'll have a chance to buy afterwards. Robin can't say that, but I can say that. Buy, and Robin will be signing copies as well. But Robin writes about the influence that his mother has had on him in terms of her spiritual practice, raised Robin and his siblings to be concerned for others, right? That we're in this world, we're all connected, and that we rise and fall together. So Adam and I are grateful to have our mothers in the house tonight.
Wow.
Yeah. So Adam's mom's Terry is in from Chicago. Yeah, beautiful to see you. My mom Marie is in from Pico and Robertson, right down the street. And my mom is just about to celebrate her 90th birthday. So
wow.
We're really So Adam and I just want to, thank both of you for setting such strong examples of being freedom fighters from way back and living life powerfully and in service of others. So we applaud you and we appreciate you. We love you.
All right, so now for our in-person audience, it's your turn. We can take a few questions for sure, and we're not going to be passing around a mic, so if you're interested in asking a question, you can raise your hand, and maybe we have a tiny bit more light in the audience, and then we will repeat back your questions and see where we go. Oh, that's awesome. Yes, please.
Hi, Dr. Kelley. Appreciate your wisdom around this issue. Appreciate you being here tonight. My question is, what have you found is the greatest obstacle to even getting the conversation started about reparations?
Capitalism.
So the question is, what's the greatest obstacle to even getting the conversation
Right.
started about reparations?
Yeah, I would say capitalism. I mean, there's two obstacles. It's three obstacles. And the three obstacles are what Dr. King said. Capitalism, materialism, and racism. Racism because this idea that somehow black people in particular have a right to some restitution for unpaid wages in centuries, that's a shocking thing to people because one of the arguments against that is that, you got all this poverty money over the years, all this welfare. Really? I mean, it's the stupidest thing that you can even say. And yet people will put that argument forward. Materialism because this idea that somehow wealth is finite. And for me to support reparations as a wealthy person or as a white person, I'd have to give up something. And the fact that, as you both said, and I think one of your shows, just what we call the racial wealth gap is 10 to 1. It's like, it's like $100,000 for white medium wealth versus about, what, 7,000, 8,000 for black people. So there's a reason for that. But this idea that somehow you have to give up something, you know. And then finally, you know, so got racism, materialism, in capitalism. I mean, which is materialism, but you know, with capitalism, the idea of capitalism as a system, it has become so common sense that people can't imagine any alternative to it, despite the fact that it's not that old. In fact, industrial capitalism is not even quite 200 years in terms of its monopoly capital, or neoliberalism is about 40 years old, you know? So when talking about systems, and yet, and I go back to that amazing report, which I have the PDF of, which broke my computer. It's this massive, massive report, which lays out in great, great detail both the transfer of wealth from black labor, as well as some solutions, like how do you redistribute it? How do you think about reparations? And yet, you can give that report to a bunch of people, and they still won't believe it, you know? So there's no shortage of evidence, and no shortage of knowledge, no shortage of research. But we are stuck, you know, under ideology, which gets in the way, and it's getting worse. It's getting worse. It's never, I'm an old person, and it's never been as bad in terms of just straight up state legislative support of lies that they're passing as knowledge. And so the fact that in the name of anti-indoctrination, you've got states, not just Florida and others, that are making it illegal to talk about reparations in the classroom. So that's, you talk about an obstacle, you know, you could be a teacher and go to jail on a felony charge. This is America. Yes, not just Florida. It's not.
Good evening, everybody.
Yeah.
My name is Rachel. My husband Joe and I drove out from Diamond Bar, so
Okay.
as far as Chicago. So you answered my question initially about the interim report. In speaking about that, was there anything that you found striking or really surprising for you as you reviewed the report?
And sorry, but for our live streaming audience, the question was about the interim report of the California Task Force and whether anything surprised Professor Kelley in the interim report.
Surprised me. Well, what surprised me is that it was funded. I mean, that surprised me. But you know, I looked at who was involved. You know, Jovan Lewis, you know, Camila, others. I mean, these are really brilliant scholars. And I have to say, what surprised me was that it was even supported and published. In terms of the evidence is overwhelming. It's you know, I spent the last 35, 36 years of my life teaching this kind of stuff. So, like I said, you know, even the idea that we should all know that California is not a non-slave state. It's a myth, you know? In fact, it was a struggle over slavery that was the heart of the U.S.-Mexico War, you know? So there's a lot that people need to read. I think one thing about the report, though, is that I really encourage people to read the whole thing because there's amazing history there. An amazing, it's not just, it's not a brief. You know, it's not a legal brief. It is a document, a historical document, which lays out the case, I think, thoroughly in a way that I think is incontrovertible.
Question in the back there.
Yes. Hello, my name is Ocean Argelia. So when we're talking about reparations, we're talking about repairing and rebuilding something. But something I've been thinking a lot about, especially because we are an episode of the Tulsa Race Massacre, is about how do we actually account for the loss of time, something that you can't get back. I'm also thinking of folks who are incarcerated or those who have been executed by this country wrongfully.
Right.
Where do we even begin to seek reparations for
Exactly. That's an excellent question. And let alone people being executed for things they may have done. I think, you know. But let's just go back to this question of time. That's a crucial one, because when we think, well, let's just make a list of things. There's a loss of time. There is the loss of our children's time. There's a loss of the possibility of I mean, if you think about slavery, for example, the idea that you don't have the right to have a family, that the patriarch is the slave master, and the sales of children, the loss of their relations is something that you can't calculate, right? Think about other kinds of violences that, you know, luckily the people are talking about this now, but gender-based violence, sexual violence, you think about the conditions of work, let alone the loss of wages. You can't just calculate wages. You have to count what are the conditions of work. But let me just say this. Once you start to bring in all those things, which I think are important, then we have to look at the whole system. And when we look at the whole system, and again, people are differentially exploited and oppressed. So I'm not saying it's all the same. You've got to then deal with all these other people whose time was taken, whose lives were destroyed, who may not have been formal chattel slaves. There's a line in William Darrady's book, and it's a very fine book in many ways, but there's a line in there that really disturbed me about Asians. And again, I've been thinking about this for a long time, where he says, you know, Asian Americans were voluntary migrants. It's not really true, because if you talk about the history of coolie labor, there's all kinds of descendants of Asians who were not voluntary. And in fact, most migrants in this age of 19th, 20th, 21st century refugees are not voluntary, you know? But to say that somehow they're voluntary and so therefore there should be no reparations, well, when you talk about the actual enslavement of Chinese or people from South Asia and being put on plantations, you know, we should talk about that as well. We should think about that. And of course, I'm going to get pushback saying, well, you know, we got to do one thing at a time. Why you muddy the waters? Well, at what point do we think about the interrelationships among people, you know? And how there's a really important story of African slaves and Chinese coolie workers who are on the same slave ship. You know, there's actually a graphic novel about this. At what point are we willing to acknowledge those relationships? At what point are we willing to acknowledge the slavery of indigenous peoples? I got people in Jamaica who were descendants of enslaved people in North Carolina who were sent, right, enslaved and sent to the Caribbean. You know, at what point do we include them? So I think it's important to really look at the big picture and do exactly what you're doing. Look at every single aspect of exploitation, extraction, and violence and dispossession, and look at it all. And then suddenly we're going to see an earth that needs to change, and that repair is going to involve every single person in every single nation, period. There's no free space. There's none, you know. Hope that answers the question.
So I have a question. I recently was working at the Treasury Department, and in Treasury, there's a new look at racial equity. There was a counselor hired for racial equity in the Treasury, first time ever happened under the Biden administration. And one of the things that they are looking at is how can we grow the economy by being inclusive? And that's the argument being posed in terms of addressing racial inequality
Right.
and addressing racial wealth gap. My concern
Right. Well, capitalism is a moral question, and so is racism. You know, so you asked a really hard question that if I try to answer it, you're not leaving. We'll be here till tomorrow. So let me just be as brief as possible on this. My dear friend, the brilliant Kanga Yamada-Taylor, has said there's no such thing as a racial wealth gap. And what she meant by that was that you think about what is the, in fact, you said this on your show, I listened. What is the main source of wealth for the vast majority of people? It is housing. What we see as, what we treat as housing discrimination or the differential value is not an aberration. That is housing. When we look at the homelessness and who has access to housing, that's not an aberration. That is called housing. That's housing under capitalism. You know, rents, mortgages, interests, they shift based on all kinds of aspects, part of it having to do with race, but a lot of it having to do with the way the market functions, which, as you mentioned, is inseparable from the kind of racial and gendered structure of our society. So it's like unavoidable. And I'm not saying that you could make a better capitalism. You can't make a better capitalism because capitalism will always be based on some form of differentiation because it has to. That's its oxygen, you know? Even class is differentiation, that's its oxygen, you know? And you create classes by making sure that some people don't have access to certain things. It's not a deliberate, conspiracy. It's the way the system works. So what we have to do then is step back and say, well, do we really want to grow the economy based on the same system, or can we think about what an economy would look like that does not permit homelessness, that caps rents, that doesn't engage in certain kind of predatory lending practices in which you can bundle up mortgages in like these subprime loans and then distribute them and sell them and resell them, and then the whole market collapses. That is not sustainable. But the point is, if you're a true capitalist, you don't care if it's sustainable. In fact, you don't want it to be sustainable. You want it to be unsustainable because you always can find new markets and new ways to accumulate capital. So that's the lesson we need to learn. We keep doing this thing where we're like, well, you know, people need financial literacy. And financial literacy actually translates as how to best invest your money, but not actually how the system works. You know? Like we don't know how money works.
We definitely don't want to teach how
Right.
the system works.
Yeah. And once you learn how the system, to me, that's financial literacy, like understanding how the system works. Once you do, then you're going to start making demands like they do in Berlin, saying we actually want social housing. I mean, what's wrong with social housing? What's wrong with sort of creating spaces where people could live comfortably and you don't translate that into the accumulation of wealth, which then you could then invest in something else. We could do something, we can do better than that. I'm sorry, long answer.
No. Thank you. We have time for one or two more.
Yeah, way back, yeah.
Hello, so we talked about time, we talked about reparation. We also talked about wealth in terms of housing and how certain communities took advantage of or was giving the advantage of gaining that wealth. And so I look at it now where we look at people of color who are slower to get into that housing market and build that wealth. And then I stop where we are right now, freezing in time and looking at the pandemic and looking at what happened, at least in California, where plenty of people of color started to lose that property because there were laws put in place. And so then the people who already had that generational wealth could go and gobble up. So what happens when you have that sandwich generation, when you were
Mm-hmm. Do you want to repeat that question?
Yeah, do my best, yeah. That was a deep question and had a lot to it. But I think part of your question was about some of the things that we saw during the pandemic and people of color and trying to maintain what they have and wealth and so forth, and how without a lot of the extra resources, that was a time when things were very difficult to even hold on to what you already have.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked a lot about the past, about reparations, and about the different forms of harms that have come before, but what about right now? And as we are here right now, what can we say about people's situation today?
Right.
Is that fair enough?
Yeah.
All right.
You know, it's impossible to talk about right now without actually being reminded that this situation that we're facing now with COVID is not that different from 2008, which is not that different from the 1980s with the savings and loan debacle scandal, which is not that different from the 1970s when you had this practice which Kianga calls predatory inclusion, where the Housing Act, the very thing that's supposed to save us, the Fair Housing Act, then allowed real estate interests to take the homes that they're trying to offload in the dilapidated homes in urban communities, and then put them on the market to be sold to poor people because the loans are guaranteed. So they don't even care if they don't pay the loan, right? So they were moving people out of housing projects into these homes that they couldn't even, that were already dilapidated, they couldn't even afford to fix, saying that, oh, well, this is better than being a renter, and they'd lose those homes. In other words, what you just described is exactly the history of the last 100+ years of black people in home ownership. It's like a repeat, let alone go back to the billion-dollar lawsuit around land loss, right? That was against a USDA, right? Now, jump to the present. One of the things I keep harping on all the time, and forgive me, is that we have to know exactly what happens, because sometimes things look one way when other things are happening. And so I'll give you an example. California. Do you know who owns a lot of the property? It's not like just wealthy white people in Orange County. It's private equity. See, that's where, so there are homes that are empty, and private equity is global. You have companies like Blackstone, right? That's buying up residential properties, like massive numbers. So they're displacing people, and that raises the rents and raises, the value in some way. That's the idea, so that they could offload it and make more money, right? So we have to understand private equity and how it's working and how it's functioning. Otherwise, we're going to think that somehow we just are not making enough money, or that the problem is domestic, the problem is local, the problem is that, I've just been laid off from my job and I can't make those payments. What's happening now is scandalous, and it's affecting everybody, black people especially, but it's affecting everybody, And yet California had the opportunity to pass a law that would have reduce the power of private equity, also would have capped rents, and they voted against it. California, so don't give me the bullshit about Florida as being so terrible. This is not a great place, the West Coast, the left coast. This is a state that voted against rent control. Why? Because private equity put a lot of money into like advertising, saying it's a terrible thing. And we went for the okie doke. So I'm with you. We need to know what we're doing right now, but here's my big thing. We've got to always look at the biggest picture possible, because when you look at the big picture, you see things that you can't see, in the space that we're struggling in. And it requires all of us to see together, and if we don't see the big picture, we're going to continue to come up with strategies that cannot change things. The strategies that could put a Band-Aid on something, but they will not change anything. And that's my answer, hopefully. It's not pessimistic, but it's one that's determined, you know, that we need to make some changes, big ones.
Professor Kelley talks about that very subject in the end of his new preface to the book about why freedom dreams are so important for all of us. And I want to quote you briefly. Without new visions, we don't know what to build, only what to knock down. We end up confused, rudderless, and cynical. Making a revolution is not a series of clever maneuvers and tactics, but a process that can and must transform us. Robin, we are deeply grateful for you to come here tonight and share your time and wisdom with all of us.
Thank you so much.
So we would love to keep this conversation going. We could talk to Robin for another hour. He's not trying to have that, and the theater has us moving on. But a couple of closing notes. You can donate to the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, and COBRA, which has been fighting for reparations for a long time. Dr. Kelley is been a supporter and connected with the organization for several years, so that's a place you can donate here on the spot or online. You can also, as I mentioned earlier, out in the lobby, pick up Freedom Dreams, right? Awesome book. Check it out, The Black Radical Imagination. Robin will be signing copies out there. Shout out to Essalon Books, a mainstay in the local book scene. Essalon has closed their physical space in Leimert Park, but they are still open for business online, so please support them and other Black booksellers.
Yes.
We thank you, the audience here, for being such an awesome audience, great energy and great questions. The audience out there, we can't see you, but we can feel you. Thank you.
We know you're there.
We hope you're there. Again, thanks to the folks here at Greenway Court Theatre for hosting us and for inviting us to do this. And really, mad thanks for Robin D.G. Kelley. Is he a bad dude or what? Yeah. So we're going to get out of the way, but we have some great music lined up for Deucalion and Maxie Payne. You can hang out here, listen to the music, go get some books, go out. There's some snacks out there, chill, whatever you want to do. But thank you for joining us for Pay the Tab. Keep coming back.